The Resettlement Services office at Verath Transit Station was at Unit 2487, which was on the 14th level of the station's residential administrative section. In the corridor that connected the transit allocation processing area to the temporary housing assignment office, and which was organized with the specific, functional logic of a system that had been designed by people who understood the system and that produced, for people who did not yet understand the system, the specific, uniform quality of corridors that all looked like the corridor you were looking for until you were at the wrong door. Sael had been in transit for 30 hours. She had not slept for 30 hours, which was the specific, accumulated weight of a transit system that moved people from one location to another with the efficiency of a system designed for transit rather than for the people transiting, the noise, the crowding, the documentation at each junction that was in standard because standard was the common language and which required her to translate in real time in the specific, depleting way that real-time translation required. Her daughter had slept in the last 6 hours of the transit, which was the sleep of a child who had been moving through unfamiliar environments for long enough that the unfamiliar environment had ceased to be a reason not to sleep. Sael had not slept because Sael had been watching the documentation and the junctions and the transit allocation, and the piece of paper with the address that the transit volunteer had written in the hurried hand of someone, writing faster than their care could follow. Unit 2487. She had the paper in her hand. She had been reading the paper for 20 minutes. The corridor designations made sense to her now in the way they made sense after 20 minutes of navigation, the alphanumeric system organizing itself into the logic it had once the logic was visible. She was at the 14th level. She was in the correct corridor section. She was looking at the unit numbers and following them to the unit she was looking for. She found it. Unit 2847. The number matched what she had been reading the paper as, which she had been reading the paper as for 20 minutes, which was the number her visual processing had organized the characters on the paper into, and which was the number she was going to knock on. She rehearsed the plea while she stood at the door. She had been rehearsing it since the last transit junction. The standard words she knew, arranged in the order most likely to communicate the essential things quickly, with the words she didn't know marked for gesture, or for the translation device she had in her bag if gesture was insufficient. The essential things were: she had a transit allocation, she had a daughter in the holding area, she needed to begin the intake process before the volunteer shift changed. She had documentation. She had been rehearsing it in the specific, focused way of someone preparing to do something that was important, and that they did not have full confidence in their ability to do, but that they were going to do regardless, because the alternative was not doing it. She knocked, the door opened. She began the rehearsed plea. She said, "I have documentation for." She looked at the face. Every word she had rehearsed was gone. Not gone in the way of forgetting, gone in the way of something being removed by something larger. The plea displaced by the specific, total impossibility of what her visual processing was sending her, and what her memory was doing with what her visual processing was sending her. He looked at her. Neither of them said anything. The corridor continued being the corridor behind her. The station continued being the station around them. The door was open and he was standing in it, and she was standing in the corridor, and 7 years was the specific material thing between them, and was also in this moment not there. Calder Voss had been in the residential unit at 2847 for 14 months, which was long enough to have unpacked the things he had, and to have organized the space into the functional configuration of someone who was staying for a defined period, and was not treating the staying as permanent, but was not treating it as temporary in the way that prevented him from putting his books on a shelf. He had the books on a shelf. He had the tea he preferred in the cabinet. He had the workspace organized the way he organized workspaces, which was by the current project's priority rather than by any categorical system, and which produced, to outside observers, the appearance of disorder, and was in fact a precise and continuously updated representation of his current operational state. He had been working when she knocked. He had gone to the door with the specific, ambient awareness of someone who was not expecting a visitor, but who had learned, over 11 years of aid work in settings where unexpected visitors were frequently the people who most needed to find you, not to treat the unexpected visitor as an interruption. He had opened the door with the neutral, open expression of someone who did not know what was on the other side and was prepared to find out. What was on the other side was Sael Vorkethis, who had been on his homeworld's evacuation transport that had not been destroyed. He had not been on the transport that had not been destroyed. He had been on a different transport, the coalition workers' transport that had been rerouted and that the record's error had listed as destroyed, which had put his name on the negative survivors list for 6 months and had then been corrected. But the correction had been in the coalition's internal documentation and had not propagated to the displaced person's network in time to reach her, wherever she had been. And he had spent 2.5 years after the correction trying to find anyone from her settlement through the network, and the network had been thorough and had not found her because she had not been in the network under the name the network was looking for. He had thought about her in the specific, ongoing way of someone who had not found what they were looking for and had not stopped looking, but had also been doing other things, because the other things were necessary, and the looking had reached the limit of what the available tools could find. He was looking at her now. "Come in," he said, because it was the next thing. He said it in her language, which he had been speaking badly for 3 months in the settlement, and had been keeping in practice since, because keeping it in practice was what you did when you had learned something and did not want to lose it, and which he had been more motivated to keep in practice for specific reasons that the keeping in practice had not resolved. She came in. He made tea. He made it in the specific, focused way of someone doing something with their hands because their hands needed something to do, and the something should be useful. The kettle and the cups and the process of tea production providing the structure that the next few minutes required. He heard her sit at the table. He heard her not say anything, which was not the silence of someone who had nothing to say, but the silence of someone who was processing something that was taking all the available processing capacity and was not yet producing output. He put the tea in front of her. He sat across from her. He looked at her face, which had 7 years in it in the specific, visible way that 7 years were visible in someone you had known before the 7 years. The same person and the years around them. The same person and the things the years had done. The transport, she said, in the specific, careful standard of someone who had been maintaining the language and was now using it at the level they had maintained it to. The coalition transport. The survivors list. There was a records error, he said. The transport was rerouted. The error listed it as destroyed. It took 6 months to correct. She looked at the tea. 6 months, she said. I spent 2.5 years after that trying to find anyone from the settlement through the displaced persons network, he said. The network didn't find you. I was in a secondary transit allocation under the colony's administrative designation, she said. Not under my personal documentation. There was a processing error at the first transit point. I was documented under the colony designation for 14 months before the correction reached my file. He sat with this. 2.5 years of looking and a 14-month documentation error that had put her in a different search category than the one the looking was using. The specific, precise way that people disappeared from systems that were supposed to track them. Not by intent, but by the accumulated weight of processing errors in systems that were managing more than they were designed for. What happened after the correction, he said. She told him. She told it in the specific, plain way of someone who had organized the 7 years into the shape that made them speakable, which was not the shape of everything that had happened, but the shape of what could be said at a table with tea in the first 20 minutes. The settlements, the transit postings, the work she had been doing, documentation support for coalition intake processing, which was work she had found because it was the work that needed doing, and because the 7 years had given her a thorough familiarity with intake documentation systems from the applicant's side, and the familiarity had been, in the specific, useful way of things that were acquired through difficulty and were useful afterward, applicable to the support role. The station before this one, the transit that had brought her here, the piece of paper. I was trying to reach the resettlement office, she said. I have a transit allocation and a daughter in the holding area. He looked at her. How long has she been there? The volunteer shift changes in. She looked at the timepiece on her wrist. 90 minutes. He stood. Show me the documentation. She showed him the documentation. He looked at the transit allocation, the intake paperwork, the daughter's secondary filing, the specific organized package of someone who had been through intake processes before and knew what the intake required and had assembled it correctly. He took the documentation and his coalition identification and his station registration and he put on his coat. We'll go to the resettlement office now, he said. I know the intake lead for the current shift. The holding area volunteer change won't affect the intake status with a coalition representative present. She looked at him. You have a coalition identification, she said. 11 years, he said. The work continued after the homeworld. He looked at her. It was the work that was there. She stood. She picked up her bag. She looked at him in the specific, held way of someone who was going to say something and was deciding whether now was the right moment. And then she said it because the moment was the one available and available moments were what you used. She still asks about you, she said. My daughter. She still asks about the human who used to read them stories. He stood in the unit with his coat on and the documentation in his hand. What does she ask? He said, in the voice he used when he was being careful about the register. Whether you remember her name, she said. She has been asking since she was old enough to understand that some people were lost and some people were gone, and that the difference mattered. Tell her, he said, that I remember her name. Tell her yourself, she said. She's in the holding area. Myra was 9 years old and had her mother's quality of assessing new environments quickly, and her own quality of not completing the assessment until she had all the available information, which at 9 years old she had developed into a practice that adults found either impressive or unsettling, depending on how they felt about being assessed by a 9-year-old. She was awake when they arrived at the holding area, because the volunteer shift change had been 20 minutes ago, and the new volunteer had moved the cot to the slightly brighter section near the monitoring station, which was the volunteer's preference for keeping visual track of her charges, and was not Myra's preference for sleeping. She was sitting on the cot doing the assessment of the new volunteer and the monitoring station, and the two people who had just come through the holding area entrance, one of whom was her mother, and one of whom was someone she had not seen in 7 years, and was 9 years old, and had been 7 years old the last time she saw him. She looked at him for a long time. You're older, she said. Your hair is different. 7 years, he said. So are you. I'm 9, she said, with the precision of someone correcting a vague statement with a specific one. I was 7. You used to mispronounce my name. I still probably do, he said. Correcting me was your most reliable method of getting me to stop the story and pay attention. She looked at him with the expression that was the 9-year-old version of her mother's expression for things she was taking seriously. Say it, she said. He said her name. He said it in the specific way. He had been saying it for 7 years. In the practice he had maintained against the day the practice would be relevant, which had required him to have a reference, and he had had the reference in the form of a recording. He had made of himself saying the names in his 3rd month in the settlement, because his pronunciation had been bad enough that he had wanted documentation of his own errors for correction purposes. She looked at him, then she looked at her mother, then she looked at him again. You remembered, she said. You corrected me 43 times, he said. I counted. I counted 51, she said. Then 8 of them didn't register as corrections at the time, he said. She considered this with the focused attention she brought to information that required consideration. That's possible, she said. Some of them were gestures rather than verbal corrections. The gesture corrections were the most effective, he said. The look. The look, she confirmed, in the tone of someone acknowledging a professional technique. It worked on the other children too, when they got the pronunciation wrong. You were 7 years old and you were the pronunciation enforcement officer for an entire classroom, he said. Someone had to be, she said. Her mother was standing slightly behind him and to the left, which was the position she had been standing in since the holding area entrance, and which was the position of someone who was watching something that was producing a specific, difficult-to-categorize quality of feeling, and who needed the slightly behind and to the left as the spatial expression of that need. He looked at her. She looked at him. He turned back to Myra. "We need to get you to the temporary housing allocation," he said. "There's intake documentation to process, and after the intake you can sleep somewhere that isn't a cot under the monitoring station lights." Myra looked at the monitoring station lights, which were the lights she had been not sleeping under. "The lights are too bright," she said. "I know," he said. "The new volunteer prefers visibility." "I prefer darkness," she said. "Noted," he said. "Let's go get you some." The intake at 2487 took 4 hours, which was faster than the standard timeline by approximately 2 hours, which was the effect of a coalition representative with 11 years of familiarity with intake documentation, presenting a complete and correctly assembled application to an intake lead who knew the representative, and found the documentation to be exactly what it was supposed to be and processed accordingly. The housing allocation was temporary and was also walls and a door, and not the holding area, and Myra assessed it in her specific, practiced way, and concluded it was adequate and went to sleep in the smaller room with the efficiency of someone whose sleep debt had been accumulating and had now found the right conditions for resolution. He stayed. He stayed because Sael had asked him to stay, in the specific way she asked for things, which was directly and without the management of how the asking would appear, and because the T in the housing unit's standard allocation was not what either of them would have chosen and was T, and making it gave his hands something to do while the intake adrenaline resolved into the specific, quiet quality of a late evening in an unfamiliar unit with a familiar person. "The story," she said. "Myra said you might remember it. She gave you an accurate assessment," he said. "She has been continuing it," she said, "for 7 years. She tells me the parts she invented when she needed to know what happened next." He put the tea on the table. He sat across from her. He thought about the story, which had started in the temporary school as an improvised thing to fill the last 20 minutes of a session where the planned activity had finished early, and which had grown, across the 3 months of sessions, into the specific, layered kind of story that grew when you were building it for a specific audience. And the audience told you, by the quality of their attention, what the story needed to do next. "What happens in her version," he said, "after where I stopped." She told him. She had 7 years of Myra's continuation in the specific, detailed way of a mother, who had listened to the continuation being told and retold across 7 years of different settings. The transit camps and the allocation hostels and the work postings and the temporary accommodations. The continuation carrying across all of them, because the continuation was Myra's and Myra carried it. He listened. The characters were the same. The world they lived in was the same world, built in the 3 months of sessions from the accumulated suggestions of a classroom of children who had specific and strong opinions about what should exist in a story. The second half was different in the way of something that had been built by someone who had needed it to continue, and had continued it in the direction the needing required, which was not the direction he would have taken it, but was a direction the story had needed to go. "She's a better storyteller than I am," he said. "She learned from you," Sael said. "The beginning, the structure, the thing you do where you stop right before something happens and make the next session start from the stop point." "The cliffhanger," he said. "Yes," she said. "She does that. She does it deliberately and she knows she's doing it and she is not apologetic about it. She was not apologetic about the pronunciation corrections either, he said. No, she said. She is not a person who apologizes for accuracy. He thought about the classroom. He thought about the specific, particular quality of a temporary school, in a settlement that had been a storage facility before the war made everything temporary, and the children who came every morning with the determined quality of people who had decided that the temporary school was worth coming to, and the mother who stayed after the other parents left, asking questions. Yes, she said. There's an office on the 15th level that handles the secondary documentation corrections, he said. The kind that come from the transit processing errors, the colony designation issue from your first transit point. If that's still in your file, it may be affecting the housing allocation category. It was corrected, she said, 14 months after. The correction may not have fully propagated, he said. These systems have latency. I've seen a corrected error affect allocation categories for up to 2 years after the correction date. She looked at him. You know the 15th level office, she said. I know the documentation lead, he said. I'll go with you tomorrow. She was quiet for a moment with the quiet that was not avoidance. You have your own work, she said. My work is documentation support for coalition intake processing, he said. Your situation is within the scope. I did the same work, she said, from the applicant's side. I know, he said. You can review the documentation yourself if you want. I'll identify the fields. I would want to, she said. I would like to understand what is in my file. That's a reasonable thing to want, he said. She looked at the T. She looked at the table, which was the housing unit's standard allocation table, and was not the table she would have chosen, but was a table, and was in a unit that had walls and a door and Myra asleep in the smaller room. The door, she said. Yes, he said. I was trying to find 2487, she said. I read it as 2847. The 7 and the 4, he said. Yes, she said. The human alphanumeric system. The 7 and the 4 are visually close in the script form the volunteer used. My processing organized them in the wrong order. 3 corridors and 4 floors, he said. Yes, she said. That is the distance between 2487 and 2847. He looked at her, she looked at him. Outside the temporary housing unit, Verath Transit Station was doing its station work, the corridors moving their corridor traffic. The resettlement office at 2487 having closed for the evening and having processed the day's allocations. The transit holding area cycling through its shifts. The ordinary machinery of a station that moved people from one situation to the next situation and was organized for the moving and not for any particular outcome of the moving. What do you need? He said. Not the intake version, the plain version, the question in the register that had always been the register. She told him. She told it in 2 minutes, specifically and plainly, the things that were immediate and the things that would take time and the things that were unknown, and that the unknown was a variable she had been managing and was managing. He told her what he could do tomorrow and what would take longer and what required the 15th level office and what required the coalition's displaced persons documentation update, which he could file on her behalf if she wanted him to, and she could review the filing before it was submitted. She said yes. He said he would draft it tonight. She said he didn't have to do it tonight. He said he had been looking for her in the displaced persons network for 2.5 years after the record's correction, and the draft was not a burden. She looked at him for a long moment. You were looking, she said. Yes, he said, in the network. Yes, he said. For 2.5 years, she said. The network had a scope limitation I couldn't work around, he said. The colony designation issue meant you were in a different search category. I didn't know about the processing error. I didn't know about the record's error, she said. On the transport, I didn't know there had been a correction. No, he said. The correction was in the coalition's internal documentation. It should have propagated further than it did. These systems have latency, she said. Yes, he said. 7 years of it, she said. He looked at the table. He looked at his tea, which was the standard allocation tea, and was adequate and was not what he would have chosen. I'm going to draft the displaced persons update tonight, he said. You can review it in the morning before the 15th level office. If Myra wakes up before you need to leave, she can come to the 15th level office or she can stay here. I can ask the building volunteer coordinator to check in during the morning. She won't want to stay, she said. She'll want to come. Then she can come, he said. The documentation lead on the 15th level has a good relationship with children who correct pronunciation. She looked at him. Does he mispronounce things? She said. Frequently, he said. He's been on the station for 6 years and has never prioritized the Cathari phonetic distinctions. Myra will have opinions about that, she said. Myra will improve his pronunciation, he said. It will be efficient for everyone. She was quiet for a moment. Then the quiet shifted into the specific, particular quality of something that had been held for 7 years and had found, in a temporary housing unit at a standard allocation table with inadequate tea, the moment where it could be held differently. Not released, it was too much for release, which was a word that implied it could be set down, and this could not be set down. Held differently, carried in a new configuration. The story, she said, Myra's version. She's going to want you to hear it from her directly. I would like to hear it from her directly, he said. She'll want to start from the beginning, she said. Not from where she continued it, from the beginning. The beginning is where I start too, he said. I know, she said. That was the thing in the settlement in the sessions. You always started from the beginning. Every session, the recap. You never assumed they remembered where you had been. Children remember the emotional content, he said. The plot is what they sometimes need the recap for. She remembered both, she said. In 7 years of telling it, she has not deviated from the plot in any session. Only the continuation is hers. The beginning is exactly yours. He thought about a 7-year-old who had become a 9-year-old carrying a story exactly. For 7 years. Against the day the person who started it would be available to hear the parts she had added. She was waiting, he said. She was keeping it accurate, Sael said. So that when she found you, when she decided she was going to find you, the version she had was the correct version. He looked at her. She decided she was going to find me. 3 years ago, she said. She was 6. She told me she was going to find the human who started the story because the story was not finished, and it needed the person who started it to finish it correctly. She looked at the smaller room's door, beyond which a 9-year-old was sleeping the sleep of someone who had arrived somewhere and found it adequate. I told her the galaxy was very large. She told me that the galaxy being large was not a reason not to look. He was quiet for a long time. She's right, he said. She usually is, said Sael. He looked at her across the table. She looked at him. The station's evening continued its evening around them. And the tea was what it was. And the temporary housing unit had walls and a door. And the smaller room's door was closed. And the filing he was going to draft tonight was in his head in the organized way of someone who had been doing this work for 11 years and knew exactly what the filing required. In the morning, he said, the 15th level. In the morning, she said. I'll bring the draft, he said. You can review it over breakfast. The standard allocation includes breakfast provisions, she said. I checked the unit inventory. I know what it includes, he said. It's the same allocation as 14 months ago when they last updated the standard. The tea is the same allocation tea. It's not very good, she said. No, he said, it isn't. The tea in the settlement, she said. The tea the coordination office had. I know, he said. I've been thinking about that tea since I left. She looked at him with the expression he had been learning to read since the door, which was the expression that existed on the other side of 7 years, and a survivor's list and a number transposition, and was, in this specific